Bienvenidos todos a la serie de conferencias de Líderes Internacionales, una iniciativa de nuestro Laboratorio de Salud Mental y Bienestar, para conectar expertos internacionales con la comunidad mexicana. Esta iniciativa nace debido a la gran brecha que existe entre el conocimiento basado en ciencia y el acceso a este. Para ello, hemos diseñado una serie de conferencias en línea gratuitas que serán impartidas por expertos internacionales con el fin de que puedan ser de utilidad tanto para profesores y estudiantes como para la comunidad en general, incluyendo profesionistas de diferentes áreas y padres de familia, con la facilidad de tener acceso desde cualquier ubicación. Esta iniciativa también tiene como objetivo el desarrollo de nuevos proyectos de investigación y de la ampliación y consolidación de redes de colaboración académica internacional. Con el fin de unir esfuerzos y llegar a un mayor número de personas, estaremos colaborando en cada conferencia con una institución mexicana. En esta ocasión, nuestra colaboración es con la Sociedad Mexicana de Psicología Positiva. Permítanme presentarme. Soy la doctora Julia Gallegos Guajardo, profesora investigadora de la Escuela de Psicología de la UDEM y directora del Laboratorio de Salud Mental y Bienestar. Nuestro laboratorio tiene como objetivo el realizar proyectos de investigación en las temáticas de prevención e intervención temprana para la ansiedad infantil, adaptación cultural y validación de intervenciones e instrumentos, resiliencia y competencias socioemocionales y psicología positiva.
Hola, y yo soy Margarita Tarragona, soy presidenta de la Sociedad Mexicana de Psicología Positiva. Nuestra sociedad tiene como objetivo unir y tener en contacto tanto investigadores que se dedican a estudiar científicamente la felicidad y el bienestar, como a profesionales de la psicología que aplican estos hallazgos para promover el bienestar de las personas en diferentes ámbitos, desde la clínica, la educación y las organizaciones. Me voy a permitir comentarles un poquito de la parte tecnológica de nuestro webinar para después tener el honor de presentar a nuestra invitada especial, la doctora Lara Aknin. Bueno, a lo mejor ustedes ya están familiarizados con Zoom, pero si no, hagamos un breve... perdón. Antes de eso, aquí compartimos con ustedes algunas ligas de páginas que pueden ser de interés. Tenemos la Sociedad Mexicana de Psicología Positiva, la UDEM, quienes coauspiciamos. Gracias, muchas gracias, doctora Julia Gallegos y el Laboratorio por invitarnos a ser coanfitriones de este evento. También aquí tenemos a la web de la doctora Aknin, también su laboratorio de cómo el altruismo y el ayudar a los demás contribuye al bienestar. Y ahora sí, si ustedes quieren leer los subtítulos de la conferencia, verán que en la parte inferior de su pantalla, en la barra negra que hay hasta abajo, se ve un micrófono, una cámara, unas siluetas de personas y un cuadrito que tiene dos Cs, y si ustedes le aprietan ese cuadrito, salen distintas opciones. La de hasta arriba es mostrar subtítulos, o si está en inglés, show subtitle, y cuando le aprieten ahí, empezarán a salir, una vez que empiece a hablar la doctora Aknin, empezarán a salir los subtítulos de la conferencia. Si quieren hacer una pregunta, también en la sección inferior de la pantalla verán una especie de carpeta o folder con la letra Q y Q y A, de Question and Answer, la sección de preguntas y respuestas, y cuando ustedes le aprietan ahí sale una pantalla en la que pueden escribir sus respuestas. Tenemos aquí a una de las colaboradoras más cercanas de la doctora Gallegos, Gabriela, quien va a estar revisando las preguntas y sintetizándolas si es necesario para preguntarle a la doctora Aknin al final de su presentación. Muy bien, pues ahora sí tengo el honor, realmente el honor, de presentarles a ustedes a nuestra invitada de hoy, que es alguien muy especial. La doctora Lara Aknin es profesora distinguida del Departamento de Psicología de la Universidad Simon Fraser en Vancouver, Canadá. Ha sido investigadora del Instituto Canadiense para la Investigación Avanzada y es coeditora del World Happiness Report, o el Reporte Mundial de Felicidad, que a lo mejor algunos de ustedes conocen, uno de los documentos más importantes sobre la felicidad y el bienestar a nivel mundial. Ella obtuvo su doctorado en psicología social por la Universidad de British Columbia. Es un honor para nosotros que esté aquí y estoy segura que va a ser un placer escucharla y vamos a aprender mucho de su trabajo.
All right, well, thank you everyone for having me here today. My name is Lara Aknin, and I'm an associate professor of psychology at Simon Fraser University, and I'm really excited to join you remotely today. This is the first time I've ever given a webinar online, but I was saying to the organizers that I think this is just such a brilliant idea. I've been thinking and reading a lot about my impact on climate change, and as such, I've been thinking about how many conferences I should and can be attending, and I just think that this is a very forward-thinking and exciting new initiative to be hosting webinars online. And so I'm really excited to join you today, and I think this is such a lovely initiative. So thank you for having me. So as I mentioned, I am Lara, and I am a social psychologist who lives in Vancouver, Canada. And right now, as you might imagine, our weather is a little bit colder than yours. Oh, I'm having some, oh, there we go. This was a screenshot of picture of our campus last week. We had a massive snowfall, and unfortunately, this was an all too familiar sight. Now, I mentioned this weather because as a result of the heavy snowfall, I had to dig into my closet and find my biggest, warmest winter coat for the first time of the winter season. And so I dug it out, put it on, and stuck my hands in the pockets and found a crumpled up old $5 bill. And I thought to myself, yay, some extra money. What should I do with it? And that was the tough part, because every once in a while, and in fact, for many people on a daily it's a daily experience to think about how we can spend our money in ways that will yield meaningful and lasting happiness changes. And so, I thought about this myself. I've thought about it for about a decade now. And I think most people's intuitions might be to use this money to buy something small and satisfactory for oneself. So this could be just a treat, an extra latte or coffee on the way into work. It could be a small chocolate bar, or even just a little bit of extra gas in one's car. But what I'm going to be arguing in my presentation today, as you might be able to foresee from the title, is that using even small amounts of extra disposable income to help other people can have greater happiness. I'm sorry, I hope you're not seeing that notice. I'm going to try to move it away. There we go. And so the talk I've presented or prepared to walk you through today kind of addresses three overarching questions. The first is whether spending money on others by way of buying charitable, by way of buying gifts for other people or making charitable donations, what my colleagues and I have called pro-social spending, leads to higher levels of happiness than spending money on oneself. I'll present a few initial studies we've conducted along these lines, but then turn to the second question, which I think will be the heart of today's talk, which is really whether these emotional rewards of generous spending or pro-social spending might represent a universal feature of human behavior. And to address that question, I'll be pulling upon some studies and evidence collected by myself and my colleagues examining this question in rich and poor countries around the globe, among young children, even under the age of 2, and in several studies from ex-offenders who have committed some high-level offenses. And finally, in the last few minutes, I just wanted to discuss some very new and forthcoming work discussing how this evidence, how we tried to put this question to kind of the highest standards to date by looking to see whether even using the most stringent and current best practice approaches, using a registered replication report, whether these emotional rewards of generosity might pass this hardest test yet. So I'll start from the beginning and share with you some of our earliest investigations. So as a first test of this question about whether spending money generously might lead to higher levels of happiness, my colleagues and I collected data from a nationally representative sample of over 600 Americans. We asked these individuals to answer a series of questions. The first was a set of questions about how much money people spent in a typical month on 4 spending categories. So the first was expenses, rent, bills, and debt. The second was gifts for oneself. The third was gifts for others. And the fourth was donations to charity. People were asked to just estimate how much in a typical month they spend on each of these 4 categories. We also asked people to answer a one single item general happiness question using a simple 5-point scale. Now, to get a general picture of how much money people spend on themselves and others in an average month, we summed together these 4 spending categories into 2 spending indices. Specifically, we created an index of what I'll call personal spending, or how much money people spent on themselves in a typical month. People spent on bills and expenses, as well as gifts for themselves in a typical month. We also created an index of what I'll call pro-social spending, which is how much money people spent on others in a typical month. And this included estimates for how much they put towards gifts for others and charitable donations. Now, we were interested in how these 2 spending indices made people feel. And so what we did was use a simple regression equation in which we looked at whether these 2 spending indices predicted people's happiness reports. And what we found was how much money people spent on others in an average month predicted their happiness, but how much money they spent on themselves did not. Specifically, the more money people spent on others in an average month, the happier they reported feeling. Now, I think it's important to note that these findings held even when we controlled for people's income, suggesting that it's not just how much money you have, but how you choose to spend it that might matter for your happiness. And so the take-home message of study 1 then is that people who spend more on others in a typical month tend to report higher levels of happiness. Now, I think the strength of this initial study is that it provides some initial evidence linking generous spending and happiness in a large, nationally representative sample of Americans. However, I think a very important limitation that is worth acknowledging right off the bat is that these findings are strictly correlational. And so while I'm suggesting that generous spending might lead people to experience higher levels of happiness, this study cannot rule out the possibility that happier people are more likely to spend on others, or that some unmeasured third variable is responsible for this relationship. And so to examine whether generous spending actually causes or leads to higher levels of happiness, my colleagues and I conducted an experiment to address this question. Specifically, we recruited a sample of 46 undergraduate students at the University of British Columbia for a study on everyday spending choices. Now, participants, if they agreed to take part, were randomly assigned to 4 conditions in our study. Here we manipulated how much money people received to spend that day, so they received a windfall of either $5 or $20. We also randomly assigned people to one of 2 different spending conditions. So in the personal spending condition, participants were asked to spend their windfall on either a bill, expense, or gift for themselves. And in the pro-social spending condition, we asked people to use their money to buy a gift for someone else or a charitable donation. Now, importantly, everybody was asked to spend their windfall in accordance with their spending instructions by 5 research assistant, unaware of their spending condition, could call them and ask them a series of questions, most importantly, to report their happiness. Now, before I tell you what we found, I thought you might be interested in knowing how a bunch of Canadian students choose to spend an extra $5 or $20 that they're given that day. So here are a couple prototypical spending choices from our study. In the personal spending condition, we had 1 participant report buying themselves a pair of earrings, another 1 or 2 participants report buying themselves some makeup, and many participants choosing to buy themselves some food to eat alone. Meanwhile, in the pro-social spending condition, we had 1 participant buy their sibling, brother or sister, a gift, several participants choose to make a charitable donation, and many participants choose to buy food that they would give or share with other people. So how did our participants feel after buying these items for themselves or others at the end of the day? Well, here's a graph of our results. I'll just explain the layout and then tell you the take-home message. Along the x-axis, we have the 2 different money amounts people may have received, either $5 or $20 Canadian. Along the y-axis, or vertical axis, we have participants' self-reported happiness in the evening, controlling for their morning happiness. The gray bars show people who spent on themselves, and the yellow bars show people who spent on others. As you can see, the yellow bars stand taller and indicate that people randomly assigned to spend money on others were significantly happier at the end of the day. So these findings suggest that people randomly assigned to spend money on others were significantly happier at the end of the day. Now, I think these findings are important because they provide some direct support for our causal claim that spending money on others actually leads to higher levels of happiness. An important limitation, I think, and one that I'll return to in just a few minutes, is that these findings were drawn from a relatively small student sample. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we talk about how far these results might generalize. So returning to the talk outline, the first question I wanted to address, and I've hopefully helped make a clear and beginning case for, is whether pro-social spending or spending money generously leads to happiness. And I think the answer that we're seeing emerging from the data is yes. People who spend money on others report higher levels of happiness in a given month. And when people are randomly assigned to spend money on others, they're happier at the end themselves. Turning to the next question is whether these emotional benefits from generous spending might be universal. So as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the data from our perhaps most convincing experimental study and most of our initial work was conducted in North America and relied primarily on data from North American college students. Now, in light of some very well-reasoned and well-articulated arguments that North Americans, and in particular North American college students, represent an extremely thin slice of human behavior, my colleagues and I wondered whether these emotional rewards might be limited to North America or might be detectable in most humans around the globe. For instance, it seems possible that the emotional rewards of generosity might be dampened or even reversed if people are spending their limited financial resources on others, when in fact, if you have very little, you might be better off spending what you do have on yourself. If, however, we do see the emotional rewards for generosity in rich and poor countries alike, this might suggest that the emotional rewards of giving represent a more fundamental feature of human behavior. So to address this question, my colleagues and I conducted a series of studies trying to investigate first, whether people from rich and poor countries around the globe feel good when they use their resources to help others. I should mention that this is part of a larger paper, and I'll present only a few here today for the sake of time. But in our larger investigation, what we tried to do was apply Norenzayan and Heine's recommendations for studying psychological universals. And to do so, they suggest using a brief but far-reaching cross-cultural survey and pairing that with experiments conducted in diverse and well-selected cultural contexts. And together, these methods provide a gold standard for addressing questions of universality. So our cross-cultural survey, we were very fortunate to be able to analyze data from over 230,000 participants drawn from over 130 countries around the globe using data from the Gallup World Poll. And for those of you who do not know, the Gallup World Poll is the first representative sample of planet Earth. And so we were very excited to be able to explore these data. Now, fortunately for us, the Gallup World Poll contained a measure that mapped our concept of pro-social spending by asking people whether they had donated money to charity in the past month on a simple yes or no. The Gallup World Poll also asked participants to report their happiness and life satisfaction on a 1 or 2 item scale. So we simply examined whether people who donated money to charity in the past month reported higher levels of happiness while controlling for a number of important covariates. What we found was that the relationship was positive in 120 out of 136 countries, while controlling for income and a number of additional individual and country level variables. In fact, these findings can be seen in this world map here. Countries shown in green indicate a positive relationship between generous spending and happiness, while countries shown in red indicate a negative relationship. The darker the color, the stronger the relationship, and as you can see, the world is mainly green, suggesting a pervasive link between generosity and happiness around the globe. Now, while these data were very exciting in linking the possibility that generous spending might be associated with happiness around the globe, it's important to note once again that these are correlational data. So while people who donate money to charity might be happier, it's also possible that happier people might donate money to charity, or that some other variables responsible for this relationship. And so my colleagues and I conducted a series of experimental studies in relatively rich and poor nations, which I'll tell you about next, to examine whether generous spending actually leads to higher levels of happiness in rich and poor countries. So the first of these experiments was conducted in collaboration with some researchers in South Africa. And so collectively, we recruited some studies for what we call our Goodie Bag Study at both universities. And the study might be it's not very complicated, but I'd like to walk you through it because I'll be using this paradigm or study design several times. So it started with participants reporting their baseline happiness or how they felt in the moment when they started the experiment. Then, after answering a couple filler questions, participants were told that they had earned a few additional dollars as part of a study payment, and they could use this money, should they choose, to buy a goodie bag filled with chocolates or juice that was valued at a slightly higher amount. So in Canada, participants received $2.50, and in South Africa, they received the approximate dollar value of around 20 Rand. And they were told that with this money, if they wanted, they could buy a goodie bag valued at $3 or 25 Rand. And so they were getting a really good deal if they bought these enticing. People randomly assigned to the personal spending condition were told that if they bought these goodie bags, these treats, they would be for them and available at the end of the study to take home. Meanwhile, participants randomly assigned to the pro-social spending condition were told that if they bought the goodie bag, they would be delivered to a sick child at a local children's hospital at the end of the study. So participants had the choice of filling whatever they wanted in the goodie bag or keeping the money for themselves. Nearly everybody bought the goodie bag, and so it was either for them in the personal spending condition or for a sick child in the pro-social spending condition. And then they received a small thank you note reminding them of what they'd done, and then they reported their happiness after their purchase. Now in this study, we took great care to rule out some alternative explanations or other reasons why buying things for others might make people happy. One thing we did was we told participants in the pro-social spending condition that if they bought a goodie bag, our lab would be donating the gifts on their behalf, meaning that they would have no contact with the beneficiary or the target of their gift. We thought that this was important because one reason giving might make people happy is that they get some positive interactions with other people. But if you aren't delivering a gift yourself, then you don't have this positive contact with the recipient. Another feature we tried to include in this study was that we kept research assistants unaware of the spending condition by using identical materials and separating the study in ways such that nobody other than the participant knew exactly who they were buying for. And this was important because we didn't want researchers being intentionally or unintentionally nice to people who were doing good deeds. We didn't want our helpers to receive extra social praise that could explain higher levels of happiness. And so we tried to use only paperwork and not have research assistants interact with our participants when they knew what was going on. So only the participant themselves knew who was the ultimate person going home with the goodie bag. Now, despite all these important controls in our study, what we observed was that people randomly assigned to buy treats for others were significantly happier afterward. than people who bought the same treats for themselves. This was true if we look across the entire sample, collapsing across participants from Canada and South Africa, but also true if we look within each country independently. So in Canada, people who bought gifts for themselves, and the same was true in South Africa. People who bought gifts for a sick child were happier than those who bought gifts for themselves. And this is particularly impressive because I think a near quarter of our participants in South Africa reported having trouble securing food for themselves and their family over the past few months, suggesting that even in rich and poor countries, we can detect the emotional rewards of generosity. So I think the take-home message of this goodie bag study is that pro-social spending or spending money on others leads to higher levels of happiness in both relatively rich and relatively poor nations, even when we try to remove the possibility that social praise or contact with the beneficiary is responsible for these effects. Now, the strength of the study is that it captures the immediate emotional rewards of generosity and minimizes alternative explanations for what might be responsible. Wanting to explore this even further, my colleagues and I decided to investigate this question in Vanuatu, where we could reach populations that weren't university students. Now, before this research question, I had never known about the island nation of Vanuatu, but this is where I traveled to in the summer of 2015 with my colleague, Tanya Brush. Here, I traveled to a village called Lunekavik, which is an inland village in the island of Vanuatu. You gotta go back upstairs. Sorry, my son is here. And it was here in this small island of Lunekavik that I was able to recruit a sample to participate in our study. Now, importantly, life in this island of Lunekavik, in this village of Lunekavik, is very different to our daily life here in North America. Here, families live in thatch houses, eat from their communal gardens, do not have running water, do not have electricity, and very little, if any, exposure to money. And so it was here that I recruited a sample of 26 adults, which was about a quarter of the population in this village, and we ran a replication of our goodie bag study. So like before, participants completed the study one by one, and they were given a small amount of, they were given an additional payment that they were told they could keep for themselves or use to purchase some candies and special treats. In the personal spending condition, people were told that if they bought treats, it was for themselves. And in the pro-social spending condition, they were told that if they bought these treats, they would have to be used or given to other people. They were not for themselves, which were very rare and special on this remote island in this inland village. And then they were asked to report their happiness on a very short 3-item happiness scale. To do so, we asked participants to point to a rung on this 11-step ladder and tell us how much they were experiencing 3 key positive emotions: happiness, excitement, and strength. So to give you a sense of what this looked like, here is a picture of the local researcher. Her name was Lija Tom, and she ran this experiment because the villagers do not speak English. Most of them were illiterate, and so she had to take notes and run the entire experiment herself. And so here she is. You can see the 3 bowls in front of her show the 3 choices of what kind of goodies people could purchase with their extra payment. And this is in a hutch, one of the participants' houses that we rented out for the day. And so what did we find after traveling halfway around the world to run a replication of our earlier study? Well, we found just what we had, very similar results to what we had seen before. Once again, we found people randomly assigned to the pro-social spending condition were significantly happier than people randomly assigned to the personal spending condition. So people who bought treats for others were happier than those who bought treats for themselves. So once again, the take-home message here is that generosity leads to higher levels of happiness than engaging in self-directed spending, here observed in a small-scale traditional society. Now, I think a weakness of this particular study is that because most of our participants were illiterate and couldn't complete the study on paper, we needed to have a researcher know exactly what people chose to do and how happy they were. But I don't think there was a way we could really design the study otherwise in this context. But what I do think is an important strength is that we were able to conduct a version of our study and examine what the emotional rewards of generosity might be in a very different cultural context. And the converging results provide a strong test for universality. All right, so the results I've presented so far are hopefully building the case for the emotional rewards of generous behavior, at least among human adults in rich and poor countries around the globe. Now, this question led me to this work led me to wonder at what age we as humans start to find giving to others rewarding. Some new research was being published demonstrating that young kids at a very early age started helping other people, and they would do so even when unprompted, so even when they were unasked. I wondered why this might be the case, and while there may be many reasons young kids help, I was wondering whether kids might help because giving makes them feel good, just like adults seem to experience as well. And so, to investigate this question, my colleagues and I conducted a short study with 20 toddlers just under the age of 2. These children came into the lab with a parent and were taken through a short 5-phase experiment. In the first phase, kids were introduced to a puppet named Monkey and told that they could pet, touch, and interact with the monkey. Then in phase 2, children were given 8 edible treats. Then in random order, children were asked to watch a prosocial act because the experimenter said, "Ooh, I found one more treat. I'm gonna give this treat to Monkey," and she did. They were asked to engage in a non-costly prosocial act. Here, the researcher said, "Oh, I found one more treat. Will you give it to Monkey?" And so the child was asked to give a treat to the puppet. And finally, the child was asked to engage in a costly prosocial act. Here, the child was asked to give one of their own treats to the puppet. So the experimenter said, "Oh, I don't see any more treats. Will you give one of your treats to Monkey?" Now, to help you get an idea of what this looks like, I thought I would show you a short clip of one of our participants engaging in the study. It's about a minute or so.
Now I want you to meet my friend Monkey. Hello. Do you want him to say hello? Can I have Monkey back? No. We're going to play a game. Yeah. Look, Monkey has a bowl just like you. Yeah. But both you and Monkey don't have any treats. Oh, no. You don't have any treats, and neither does Monkey. That's right. But look, I found even more treats, and I'm going to give them all to you. Treats. But, you know, I don't see any more treats. Will you give one to Monkey? Yeah. Yeah? Yeah. Ooh, yum, 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 yum. Oh, God. And look, I found one more treat. Will you give it to Monkey? Yeah. Ooh, yum, 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 yum. Look, I found one more treat. I'm going to give this one to Monkey. Ooh, yum, 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 yum.
All right, so hopefully that gives you an idea of what the study was like for our very cute, tiny participants. So our question was not just whether children would engage in these 5 actions, but how it made them feel. Now, as many of you might know, asking young children to self-report their own happiness can be very challenging because most kids say that they're very happy a lot of the time. And so instead of asking children to self-report their happiness, we coded their experiences and their reactions on videotape, as you just saw. Then later, we had a team of 2 trained research assistants code children's happiness expressions on a 7-point scale. Using this, we were able to examine 2 key questions. First, were children happier giving treats away to others than receiving treats themselves? And second, did the emotional rewards of generosity differ whether children were giving their own treats or something that didn't belong to them? So in short, we found that kids were happier giving treats away than receiving treats themselves. By this I mean, kids showed significantly larger smiles when they were giving treats to Monkey than when they were receiving treats from the researcher. And this was true both when children gave away their own treat, but also when they gave away the experimenter's treat as well. The second key, and what I think most exciting finding was that children showed significantly larger smiles when giving away their own treat than when giving away an identical treat that did not belong to them. This suggests that giving might be especially or when it requires people to give away their own items. So the take-home message of this study is that the emotional benefits of pro-social behavior are detectable in the early years of life. In fact, we believe that this was the first evidence showing that giving actually makes young children happy. In fact, in years since, we've also observed a similar result in Vanuatu with slightly older children between the ages of 2 to 5, suggesting that, again, this might not be limited to North America, but might be something we see perhaps across the age spectrum and around the world. So as you might know, humans are an exceptional and extraordinary instance in the human kingdom or in the animal kingdom in that we are very generous creatures. But we needn't look far to see that acts of greed and selfishness can exist in our world. Now, most terrible activity or most crime is committed by some of the same people over and over again. And these tend to be people who are high in antisocial or psychopathic tendencies. These are the individuals who have a history of engaging in acts that hurt other people. Now, while these individuals who are high in antisocial or psychopathic tendencies engage in more harmful acts and fewer acts of kindness, we were interested in whether these individuals, these ex-offenders or at-risk youth, might also experience emotional rewards from generous behavior. If so, this might provide a particularly strong test, again, for the universality of helping others. Now, as I alluded to in the early slides, this was a larger paper that was led by my former graduate student, Kate or Catherine Hannibal, along with 2 colleagues in the forensic psychology department at my institution, Simon Fraser University. These studies were much larger than our earlier studies, and I thought they were all really fun to conduct, but I don't have time to walk you through all 4 of them this evening, and so I'll be focusing on the 3rd study here, which, as you'll soon see, was an online version of the goodie bag paradigm I've spoken about already, with a large sample of ex-offenders. So in this particular study, we recruited a large online sample of ex-offenders using MTurk. And once participants logged on and started to complete our survey, they were asked to report their baseline or momentary levels of happiness. Then, Each participant was told that they had earned an additional small sum. This was valued at 10 cents in American dollars. Now, participants were randomly assigned to one of two conditions, like before. Participants randomly assigned to the personal spending condition were told that they could use this 10 cents if they wanted, which would be multiplied, which would be multiplied by 10 to create $1 of purchasing power and buy an item for themselves. Meanwhile, participants randomly assigned to the pro-social spending condition were told that if they wanted to use their 10 cents, we would also multiply it by 10 so that they would have $1 purchasing power to make a real donation to a real campaign through a website called Donors Choose. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of Donors Choose, it's a real charitable giving website where teachers in needy classrooms log on and ask people to support their classroom projects. These are often projects that help their students who are hungry eat, or complete class projects that they couldn't do otherwise because of financial need. So here, participants were able to make a real charitable decision. Now, it's important to note that in our two conditions, participants were offered the opportunity to buy similar goods. As you'll soon see, they were able to buy either a food item or a writing utensil. And in both conditions, participants could choose to use the 10 cents, have it multiplied if they wanted to buy the item for themselves in the personal condition, and in the pro-social condition make a charitable donation. But participants in both conditions also had the opportunity not to buy or not to make a donation and keep the 10 cents for themselves. The reason for this opt-out was to allow participants in both conditions to feel as if they weren't forced to buy or give. This is important because past research has shown that giving to others is only rewarding when people feel that they've chosen to make this decision. If people feel pressured to give, it does not lead to happiness. So people decided what item they wanted to buy, or what charity they wanted to support, or whether they'd like to keep the money for themselves. They received a thank you note, and then they reported their happiness. And finally, social or psychopathic tendencies and psychopathic tendencies, allowing us to ensure that we reached the appropriate population. So to help make this, I realized the last slide may have been very dense, and so I wanted to help give you a better sense of the study. So here is what our participants in the personal spending condition saw. They were told that they could keep the 10 cents, or they could use it to buy items worth $1. Their choice was either a granola bar, and they were told what it was like and why it might be beneficial, or a writing pen, a writing utensil. And they were also given a description of the item. Meanwhile, in the pro-social spending condition, participants were told they could keep the 10 cents, or they could use it to make a $1 donation to one of two real charitable causes on Donors Choose. One charitable option was to support Mrs. Sario's classroom that was hungry. Students were coming to school hungry and needed food, and so she would be buying them granola bars for snacks or breakfast. And in option two, participants were option two meant that people could support Mr. Jones's classroom and buy them pens and markers to complete their writing assignments. So note, both conditions allowed participants to buy similar goods, food items or writing supplies. We simply manipulated who was the beneficiary, themselves or someone in need. So what did we find? Well, first, I think it's important to note that we successfully recruited an antisocial sample online. We found that many of our participants reported engaging in violent crimes, some of the highest severity. For instance, some of our participants in this study reported engaging in rape, murder, and child trafficking. And the sample, on average, reported significantly higher levels of antisocial tendencies than are normally observed in community samples. And so I think this suggests that we recruited an antisocial sample, one that we might not typically see or access in our traditional psychology studies. So what did we find among this ex-offender population? Well, to our perhaps surprise, we found that participants randomly assigned to buy items for others were significantly happier after doing so than people who were randomly assigned to buy things for themselves. This was true. This was interesting because while these individuals might engage in fewer spontaneous or self-driven acts of generosity, it seems that ex-offenders, like our other emotional rewards from doing so, albeit to a slightly smaller degree. So the take-home message here is that the emotional rewards of giving might even be detectable in ex-offender samples, like I said, perhaps to a smaller degree. And so returning to the talk outline, I think the evidence I've provided so far suggests that the emotional rewards of pro-social spending or generous spending might be universal. We've seen evidence that people who donate money to charity in the past month are happier in most countries around the world, that when we conduct experiments in rich and poor countries, we detect emotional rewards from giving, more so than spending on oneself. Young children smile more when giving things away than receiving themselves. And ex-offenders also report higher levels of happiness after buying things for others than buying things for themselves. Now, as promised, I wanted to conclude today's talk by speaking to what is a large and very salient discussion, at least in my home field of social psychology and perhaps more broadly. So as many people are very likely aware, there has been a replication crisis in psychology, social psychology, and in other fields of science. In particular, new attempts to repeat old studies have often failed, and there might be many reasons for why that is. Now, I think one of the most productive outcomes of this replication crisis concern is that researchers are now being asked to collect larger samples so that we have better estimates of what's going on in our studies and to pre-register our predictions and study design. So in particular, researchers are asked to explain what their studies will look like, how they're going to compute their measures, and what analyses they'll run before they actually do so, to publicly commit to their research plans before they investigate their question. My colleagues and I recently adopted these new best practice methods and prepared a paper that is accepted in principle, examining the emotional rewards of generosity, looking at both our goodie bag design, which you've seen me talk about several times this evening, and using another methodology, which I haven't talked about, where we ask people to recall a previous spending experience. These studies are both larger and pre-registered, and so I think they provide the best test of this question to date. Now, I'll only tell you very briefly about the Goodie Bag Study, and because I think it provides the most robust evidence we've seen so far. So in line with what I have described already, we recruited a student sample from 2 institutions in Vancouver, the University. In total, we recruited over 700 participants to take part in this study. As you've seen before, participants came into the lab, they reported their baseline levels of happiness. Then they were told that they had earned an additional small sum of money that they could use to buy a goodie bag filled with treats, juice or chocolate. Participants could choose what they wanted in their goodie bags, but we randomly assigned who was the recipient of the goodie bag. In the personal spending condition, the goodie bag was for oneself. In the pro-social spending condition, the goodie bag was for a sick child at a local children's hospital. Participants made their spending decision, with the overwhelming majority choosing to buy a goodie bag. Then they received a thank you note reminding them of their spending choice. Finally, participants reported their happiness right after spending. What did we find in this large pre-registered study? We found evidence consistent with what we had seen before. So with over 340 participants per condition, we found a strong evidence for a robust effect that generous spending leads to higher levels of happiness in the moment than buying something for oneself. And so wrapping up, I think I've presented over 9 studies here today to hopefully make the case for the emotional rewards of generosity. So we started off simply asking the question of whether money can buy happiness if it's spent on others. And 2 studies, I think, offered evidence for the answer for the affirmative. First, we saw that how much money people spend on others in an average month predicts their happiness, but how much money they spend on themselves does not. And then, in a small experiment, we saw that people randomly assigned to spend money on others were happier than those who spent on themselves. Then I presented a series of studies demonstrating the potential universality of this relationship. First, we saw evidence from the Gallup World Poll that people who spend money on charity each month or in the past month report higher levels of life satisfaction. Then I told you about 2 Goodie Bag studies showing that people in relatively rich and poor nations report higher levels of happiness after using money to buy something for others than for themselves. The toddler study showed that young children under the age of 2 are happier when they give away treats than when they receive treats. And then I presented 1 study demonstrating that the emotional benefits of generosity are detectable among ex-offenders as well. Finally, I briefly covered a new study conducted examining whether these findings are detectable using best practice methods in this registered replication report. So as I mentioned, I think these findings offer support for the emotional rewards of pro-social spending in various places around the world. But perhaps more importantly, I think these findings provide a positive perspective on humanity. Oftentimes, humans are painted as selfish, silly, and incompetent or greedy individuals. And I think what these findings suggest is that humans not only have a deep connection to other people, but that generosity is what allows us to help other people and it makes us feel good. More proximately, I think these findings help people make happier spending choices so that if you, like me, find an extra few dollars in your pocket sometime, you know that you'd be happier spending it on others than spending it on yourself. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you to this amazing list of collaborators without whom this work wouldn't have been done. Thank you. So I'll open the floor to questions, and I'm happy to hear anything you've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. We're gonna start the Q&A session. I'm gonna be reading the questions in Spanish first, and then I'm gonna translate in English for you to answer. Is that okay?
Sure.
Perfect. La primera pregunta es, ¿qué implicaciones prácticas de todos estos resultados que nos estás enseñando podemos tener para aplicar en diferentes contextos, como en el contexto familiar, en el contexto escolar, en el contexto laboral y, bueno, en un ambiente universitario? So the first question is, what are the practical implications of the findings you are presenting that we can apply in different contexts, such as family, school, work, and on a university environment? Can you give us like some examples for each of these contexts?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I think the practical take-home message here might span many different contexts, but I can try to generate a couple specific examples for each. I think the general take-home message is that when we have resources, extra financial money, extra finances, we would be better off using them to help others than to help ourselves. So on a daily basis, you might have to remind me, please, of the examples of the specific context, but I think in our personal and family lives, what this might mean is that instead of buying yourself a coffee, you might buy your partner or child a special treat instead. And giving something to them might make you happier than enjoying a coffee on your drive into work. I think there was the one context was at the university.
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah, I think here again, the general message is to help others instead of oneself. And so one way in which you could use money to help others at a university might be to take your colleague for a coffee and enjoy some quality time with them and give them a gift, or to drop off a special surprise for someone who works in the office and just kind of leave them a gift, like a secret admirer. Those kinds of things might really brighten someone else's day and yours as well. Was there another context I'm forgetting?
Yes, they also mentioned the work environment.
Well, perhaps at work, I'm still thinking you could, I mean, the general message is to use money to help others. So that could be, buying someone's secretary or a colleague, taking them, treating them in some special way. So that could be, bringing a surprise bouquet of flowers to one's assistant or office neighbor, or it could just be saying thank you with a small token of appreciation, bringing a coffee to the person who works in the office next to yours.
Perfect, thank you. We have another question, so I'm gonna do the same method. I'm gonna read it first in Spanish and then in English, okay? La segunda pregunta es, ¿cómo se puede cultivar o fomentar una cultura de empatía para que las personas compartan dinero en los demás por motivación personal y no por presión? Okay, so the second question is, how could we cultivate a culture of empathy where people do pro-social spending by a personal motivation and not for pressure?
That's a great question. One research paper I didn't get to include in this talk, but one that I really love is a finding we observed where when people think back on previous instances of pro-social spending, it makes them feel happy, and the happier they feel, they want to do it again. They want to help others. And so what I think this means is that when we help others, we feel good, and feeling good leads us to want to do it again. I think this is a really positive, virtuous, generous cycle. And so I think, I have two little kids at home. You may have seen one show up here. I think what I try to do as a parent is give my children opportunities to give in hopes that they find it rewarding, it makes them happy, and so they want to, take other opportunities and reach out and try to help others again. Another interesting study I didn't have time to share here was in our original paper. We asked people whether they thought they would be happier using $5 or $20 to help others or to help themselves. And the key finding of the study was that people thought they would be happier spending money on themselves than on others, meaning they were wrong. They didn't understand or appreciate that helping others makes us happier than helping ourselves. Now, in some ways, I think that's unfortunate because it means we might overlook or fail to help others when we can. But I think the good news is that when we help others, it's probably not, we're not doing it to make ourselves feel happy, we're doing it because we care. It's often from a place of empathy and concern about other people. And so I think what we can do is try to encourage children to give, maybe not too overtly, too directly. We can kind of give them opportunities and encourage them gently so that they engage in helping behavior, they feel good about it, and they want to do it. And I also think there are ways in which, we as humans have this, we're very social creatures. We care about other people, and I think there's good reason for it. I think we evolved we're safest in the presence of other people. We couldn't survive on our own in the plains of Africa or in the jungle by ourselves. We need other people and they need us. And so I think we're very attuned to the needs of others, and generosity is one way that we build and strengthen these social connections. And I think that's driven by empathy. And so I think when we care about others, we want to give, and when we give, we care about others, and that leads to these positive feelings. And so I think providing opportunities for people to come in closer contact might lead to more generous action. And hopefully that's also, it feels good and people want to do it again. And so I think maybe I apologize if this was a long-winded answer, but I think we can structure our environments that people have more contact with other people and they want to help. And we as parents or people who, when we're around other people, we can help encourage acts of generosity. And hopefully this virtuous cycle that I described at the beginning, when giving makes us feel good and then feeling good makes us want to do it again, is inspired.
Thank you, Lara, for answering the questions and for your conference. Julia is gonna close the session.
Thank you, Lara, so much for this wonderful conference. We were all very excited to hear all the findings that you share with us. It was a very interesting presentation, and we really appreciate your time and being here with us. I want to take the opportunity to thank also very much Dr. Margarita Tarragona. They have been at the Mexican Society of Positive Psychology wonderful collaborators, and we encourage all our participants to know more about this Positive Psychology Association in Mexico. Thank you, Margarita, very much, and thank you all the participants for being interested in our webinar, and all the UDEM team that make this possible. We'll have a next webinar on the 4th of March, and we'll be sending you information. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Julia y equipo. Gracias. Thank you, Lara. What a pleasure to hear you.
Thank you.